Welcome, everyone. Wonderful to have you here. Very excited about the next edition of our Mediate.com Great Reads Book Club with Tim talking about his book Embodied Conflict, and to be interviewed by the estimable Bernie Mayer. So without further ado, why don't I hand it over to you, Bernie, and you can lead us.
All right. Well, first of all, I'm really pleased to be able to have this conversation with you, Tim. I read this book, I think, before it actually came out, because there's evidence for that anyhow on the back cover. And I remember at the time thinking, there's an awful lot written in our field and related stuff that is kind of walking over some of the same ground, some of it still taking that path forward. But this one is really creative, different, useful. It's both deeply embodied in science and theory, and also very practical. And you walk back and forth between those things very, very well. And so that's one of the reasons that first attracted me to it. And in preparing for this, I read it again, which was a good thing, since I'd forgotten, what the difference between different parts of the brain were and all of that in the time since I read it. I thought maybe a way to start, and I actually, this is what Colin did to me when he interviewed me, so I'm doing it to you, which is to get you to read something from it. And there's two passages, I think. Also, I noticed Terry Gross often does that too, so what the heck. That there's two passages that I thought might be really helpful in getting us into the spirit of the book. And the first one, because it's interesting in and of itself, but it also shows a little bit, I think, your approach to this issue. And it's about communication. So it's on page, if anybody has it and wants to follow along, it's on page 58. And it's a paragraph that starts with, "In communication, we are always dancing." Would you read that, Tim?
You want me to just read the one paragraph there?
If you want to go on, that's fine, but that would be
good. Okay, yeah. Let's see what it says. I haven't looked at this since a long time. So, in communicating, we are always dancing with the dynamics of power and control, not at a theoretical level, but at the physical level. To communicate is to influence in one way or another, and to one degree or another. To influence is to change that which we influence. As we speak together, we are involved in a process of neural change, of mutual neural sculpting in the best of circumstances, and a kind of self-protective, defensive, or assertive, or aggressive verbal jousting in more difficult conditions. In any communicational interaction, we face the prospect that we will change the other, and we will be changed by the other. We have some control, more or less depending on circumstances, over how much and in what ways we will change. In circumstances of collaboration, trust, and safety, we build neural structures together, open to being changed by each other, engaged creatively and playfully. In circumstances of conflict or disagreement, we use our words to wrestle with each other. We wield them as weapons, as swords and shields. We resist the influence of the other on our neural structures and exert force, pressing with our words in our attempt to change their neural structures. The greater the conflict, the deeper the distrust, antipathy, anger, hate, or perception of threat, the more resistant we are to change in response to the other's presence and expressions.
And one of the things I think you will go on to say in your book, and you might want to comment on that now just for a minute, is that in order to deal with conflict in a productive way, to come to better understanding, to make agreements, or we actually have to change each other's structures, and we have to let our structures, our neural structures, be changed. Or let may be the wrong word. We have to be in the right space that they can be changed. So do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, conflict resolution is a change process. If there's no change, there's no resolution. People come into the mediation room or into the negotiation in whatever state they are in, and with all of their beliefs and their ideas and their understandings, their knowings, and who they are, and all of that, as the book talks about, embodied in the construction of their brain, basically. And if there's no change, then there's no resolution. And so that whole question of change, how do we change? What are we changing? How willing are we to change? What gets in the way of change? And, as I talk about in the book, our attachment to what we know is significant. And under conditions of threat, we hold on to it more tightly. And the connection between what we know and who we are, so that in some sense, every conflict and every conflict resolution process is an identity-based conflict. Even as you and I talk right now, and as all of you listen to me, there's a part of you that's checking out, do I agree with him or do I disagree with him? Does what he is saying kind of fit enough with my own beliefs or not? Do I have to shift a little bit or not? And it can be uncomfortable to shift, as we so well know. When you nod in agreement, I like you because you're confirming my understanding of the world, and you're confirming my identity. And when you disagree with me, that's a significant event. It challenges who I am. It challenges my knowing of the world. And so that dynamic, that interchange is what's happening in relationship, in communication, and in the mediation room.
So let me just ask you something that just struck my mind the second when you were saying that, because you must have impacted my neural pathways and stimulated some memory. We in the US and broad swaths of US culture, anyhow, when we're listening to somebody, our tendency is to go like this, which doesn't necessarily mean we agree, but it is an affirmative, like, keep going, I'm interested, I may agree, I'm getting it, or this. And then, until we have something we don't agree with, and then we'll go no. In Eastern Europe, where I have done a lot of work, it's the opposite. At least it was in the period right after the fall of communism. I think they've become a little, even in some of their nonverbals, they've become more assimilated into Western European culture. But it was very obvious that people would be going like this. No, I'm still not there. No, I don't get it. No, no, until they really agreed, and then they say yes. And that actually was a cause of a lot of tensions. When people like me would go over there and would work through translators often, thinking, oh God, I have to explain better, or they're not, or what don't they get, and they were just saying, no, let's keep going. How does that play into what you just said, that kind of?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I mean, we communicate not just with our words, but with the tone of our words, with the pitch of our words, and with our body. And those messages that convey aggression or non-aggression, agreement or non-agreement, disagreement, those messages are conveyed by our body as well as our words. And so, yeah, the communicational exchange, we receive messages through the five senses that we often talk about. And those, that's not only visual, it's certainly oral as well. And in a sense, it's just, through your whole body, you can feel it in a room, One thing I talk with students about in talking about this whole subject is that in the communication act, right now, we think that meaning, as I speak with you, I'm delivering meaning to you. and understanding, but I'm not. All I'm delivering are word sounds that are, in a sense, nonsense syllables. So just sounds. That's all you're getting right now. The sounds, the word sounds that I'm using have meaning associations for me. I send those sounds across to you, they enter into your body, and they activate meaning matrices in you. And hopefully the meaning that they activate in you is close enough to the meaning I associate with those word sounds that we communicate and understand each other. But we can see when we recognize that that's what's actually happening, that all that's going between us is these sounds, and that we may have very different associations with those sounds, then we can have a better grasp on what's going on in terms of communication, understanding, misunderstanding. I've got a case right now where I know the parties have different meaning associations with the words they're using, and I'm having a hard time helping them realize that because they're so convinced that the words that they're using mean something absolute and universal.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of times what happens is that we are convinced that what we say will be heard and received in terms of not just our meaning, but the spirit in which we're saying it. And
yeah, intent and
often
impact.
we are wrong.
Yeah, the difference between intent and impact is huge.
Okay, let's move on to the second
And
thing.
often invisible. That's the other thing that we should say about this, that any difference between intent and impact, or any difference in our understanding of the associations we have with particular word sounds, will be invisible. We won't see that difference unless we explore it. And that's partly what we're doing in mediation, helping parties verbalize their experience so that it can be heard and the distinctions and differences can be seen and understood.
Right. And I would say, as a mediator, one of the most interesting, but most intellectually and emotionally challenging things is to really grasp that difference between what people are saying and how it's being heard, and to be able to kind of put it out there in a way that both people can hear it in the way I mean it. And I think that is, when that works, that is often what moves the process forward, I think. So let's go to the next one, because I think it takes us to where push comes to shove in actual mediation often. And that's on your section on positions and interests, and it's on page 94. And you've started this section out by saying that we are more naturally drawn to be positional. And in fact, that's evolutionarily, that makes sense. You argue for a number of interesting reasons. And so I'd like you to start with a paragraph that begins, as I've just discussed, and it's the last paragraph on that page, and then read through the first two paragraphs on the next page.
Okay. As I've discussed, there's comfort in knowing, in being certain, and in feeling in control. Positions provide the illusion of knowing, of certainty and control. Further, positions satisfy our problem-solving, pattern-seeking nature. They provide answers to the questions a conflict presents. Finally, positions are a kind of bulwark to our identity constructs. Interest-based negotiating can appear to weaken or challenge our identity as it calls into question what we believe we know and what we believe should happen. However, positional bargaining appears to affirm, by the assertion of the position, our beliefs about what is right, true, good, and real. There is security in having a position. A position answers a question with a certainty. What should happen? This is how it shall be. Faced with an issue, our first response tends to be to adopt a position. to propose or assert a solution, just as we tend immediately and often vociferously to take sides, to agree or disagree, or voice an opinion about any subject that is raised. And just as we do our best to explain any new perceptual stimuli within the borders of our present understanding of the world, positions are the parties I know. The shift from positions to interests is one from asserted commitment to a particular outcome to a condition of outcome uncertainty, and therefore from comfort to discomfort. We feel more vulnerable when asked to put aside our positions and to focus on our interests. With the assertion of a position, the outcome is named. With a focus on interests, the outcome is unknown. A shift from positions to interests requires a level of trust and a willingness to not know, to enter into a problem-solving learning mode. With a position, we feel safer behind the protection of its strong assertion. The overconfidence of a position allows us to feel right and righteous. In contrast, letting go of our positional stance and moving to interest-based problem solving confronts us with the possibility that we may have been wrong in our assessment of the situation, or that our original idea of what should happen will not be validated.
So I think that's a great section. And I've often said that if I had one thing I could wave a wand and make people who are in a conflict experience or feel, it would be the 3 words, be less certain.
Yeah.
And certainty is and uncertainty is a theme that you talk about a lot in your book. And I think it's a very important one because in a way, you're trying to, as you say here, break down a certain kind of certainty and open the path for uncertainty so that then a new kind of certainty can be brought into play. So maybe you might want to talk more a little bit about your concepts about certainty and why you think that's just so, and uncertainty and why that's so important too.
Yeah. I mean, there's a way in which, in order to learn, we have to not know. And if we're certainty can, I mean, ultimately we want to arrive at certainty. We want to know what's going on in the world. But if we have too much certainty at the beginning, it blinds us. And that's, a scientist needs to be in that space of not knowing in order to learn, to discover. And we're trying to encourage parties to be willing to learn in these processes of conflict resolution. And so, and they come in with their certainties. I mean, we all, even right now, I want to be certain about what I'm saying.
Certain about uncertainty.
Even certain about uncertainty, right? And if you were to challenge me and say, hey, no, wait, it's hard for me to let go, and you can feel it viscerally. And so there, there's a part of all this. We talk about reflective practice. I think partly what we're doing is trying to help parties be reflective, to be thoughtful and self-reflective and responsible in a way that they may not have been accustomed to. And that brings to mind the idea of conflict resolution beyond just trying to settle particular disputes, being a field that's talking about for the world, for the community, a different way of being in the world, where the willingness to be uncertain together is more a possibility. But as we know, and from actual in the labs research, under conditions of threat, we're much less willing to be uncertain together. And conflict is inherently a situation of feeling threatened. You're challenging me in one way or another.
So it strikes me that a lot of times, if you look at some of the language and questions mediators use, they're trying to create an atmosphere that encourages mutual curiosity. which seems to me about the same thing. I mean, is that, would you reflect on that one for just a moment?
Well, I don't know how, I'm guessing your experience is similar to mine, and that, that it's hard sometimes to get the parties to get into that space of mutual curiosity. And, in getting TS for sure, and where you talk about, shifting from the people to the problem, which is kind of about that, let's be partners in problem solving, which I talk about. I say that explicitly to parties, that, emphasizing this partnership in inquiry, but people are very resistant to that. They don't want to be a partner with this person who they, have come in feeling adversarial towards.
And I think maybe if you look at the actual, do a linguistic analysis of what certain types of mediators do, it really is to educate me, inform me. I'm really curious about this. I'd like to know more about this. Could you let us know? Which is all, it is that language of opening. And I think we often model, I often feel like I start out with being curious. And
Yes.
that's kind of a model of, I
Can I say
want
one thing? Can I say one thing about that, Bernie? That just, everything I think that I say in the book conforms to the way we practice without this kind of theoretical framework of neural encoding. But thinking about behavior and communication in terms of the neural encoding reality kind of helps support the kind of practice that we've been doing anyway. Yeah.
Well, it does. And you also open up some really, really interesting insights that go beyond, I think, what we would normally talk about. And I'd like to mention a couple that really struck me on rereading it, probably when I read it too. And one of them, I think, was about dealing with trauma and people who have been through trauma and what happens to that. And one of the things you say, and this is a trauma slows speech capacity. That in response to trauma, people don't have the ability to respond as quickly or as fully or as maybe even persuasively, powerfully. And it also, and you also say that one of the things that, and this is a little different, but it seems connected, that one of the things that effective communication and conflict requires is to slow down our stimulus response. But in order to do that, we require a sense of safety. And those both seem to me both pretty profound insights that come directly, I think, from your study of neurobiology, and important. So I'd like you to expand on that. I think I did a pretty primitive job of summarizing it.
Yeah, no, yeah. I've thought a lot about trauma and its impact. One of the ways in which kind of this whole investigation helped me was in thinking about the impact of betrayal, which is often, and this I think relates to trauma, betrayal often comes up in divorce situations. Maybe there's been an affair, a hidden affair, or a misuse of resources, a hidden stealing of resources, or things like that, or even the betrayal, if one could call it that, of you marry thinking that you're marrying the person you think you know, and then suddenly that changes in one way or another. That can be a kind of betrayal. And these betrayals, I think of a case, one divorce case. I think I may talk about this in the book. I can't remember, but it was a case in which the husband had not only had secret affairs, had not only stolen money from their bank account in hidden ways, but the story in the family, and they had children in the 7 to 14 range, I think. The story in the family was when the parents got married, they didn't have much money. And 5 years into the marriage, the man had been making more money, and he said, "Sweetie, I'm going to buy you this really wonderful wedding ring now." And he gives her this ring that the myth in the family is that it's worth $20,000. She discovers in the midst of all of this, discovering the other stuff, that it's worth, $1,000. It was a fake or whatever. So there's been a huge amount of betrayal. And what that betrayal does is it shatters the neural constructs of understanding of the world. And it's a physical reality. The neural matrices of meanings are disrupted. They no longer work. They're, it's the electrical circuits are broken. And realizing that helped me think about and respond to betrayal and trauma in a different way. Even in business disputes, I have a lot of cases with business partnerships and sometimes family and business together. The trauma, the short-term trauma of the prospect of a business collapsing and the fear that's created in the economic fear makes it very hard for people to have that openness that we were talking about, and that's required for. So, and all of this relates, to trust, which we know is so important, safety, as you mentioned, and we know in basic mediation training, you're trying to create that sense of safety for people, but there's safety within the mediation room, and then there's safety in their larger lives. It brings to, so yeah, trust, predictability is a big, can I depend on who you are? Can I depend on your behavior? Can I depend on my understanding of what you're going to do and not do? Relates to then certainty and uncertainty. And when I can't depend on you, when I can't predict, then that's a problem of trust, and it creates uncertainty, and then it's vulnerability, and then we respond. So it's so much all tied together. And I just wonder, just a thought that is not in the book, but how much the context that we're all living in, whether it's climate change and the prospects of real injury to the planet and to our societies, or what's happening in the States, at least in terms of our political and social conversations, how much that's affecting what happens in the mediation room.
Oh, sure it is.
Yeah.
I realize we're getting to the point where I think we should open to some questions, but I want to ask you one last thing, which is, so how did you get on this road to get to study the neural basis of conflict in communication? What led you there? Doesn't seem like an obvious path.
I woke up in the middle of the night years ago, this would have been, I don't know, around 1995 or so. And I don't know why this idea came to me, and it's so obvious, but I kind of woke up and I can't remember, exactly, but I had this experience of realizing the connection between our reality constructs and our identity. And I started thinking about it, and then I ended up writing an article that got published in the Negotiation Journal that was called, it was saying that everything was an identity-based conflict. And that's where it started, where reality constructs. At that time, I was still thinking, in kind of the way we tend to think about our cognitive experience, which is disembodied. The reason that there is historically in philosophy the dualistic, not only in philosophy but in our religious experiences, the difference between soul and body, spirit and body, the dualism of mind body, is because of the nature of our cognitive experience. I kind of feel like I exist separate from my body, and my ideas are kind of, I don't know, in some kind of ephemeral state. And I've come to realize that all experience, all cognitive experience, all identity experience is somatic, that our ideas and our thoughts are sensations in the body. And that I always say to audiences when I'm giving talks, that this doesn't dispute or get involved in the question of whether there is a soul or a spirit separate from the body. But we do know from brain injury, from dementia, from the impact of drugs, from surgical interventions, that if you mess with the brain, you mess with cognitive experience and identity experience. So it just, more and more over the years, kind of realizing that we are physical beings, and the characteristics of the function of the body provide windows of into understanding why we behave the way we do, why conflicts come up. Why is it that we fight with each other in the way we do? And a lot of it has to do with this reality construct subject, and the balance between brain plasticity and stability, and that need to know, as you mentioned earlier, evolutionarily determined. We want to be able to depend on our understanding of the world. So yeah, it's just become more and more of an interest of mine.
Well, I'm grateful that it has been. I'm biting my tongue with all sorts of more questions I want to ask, but I think I better let other people have a chance.
I know there's so many great topics for us to dive into here, and a lot of great stuff has come out in the chat. But why don't I go to Milan first? Milan, I think you had some questions you wanted to surface for Tim.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Colin, for allowing me to ask the question. The question really relates to something what was asked in the very beginning. It is the concept of change, which you introduced. When I think about the change and working with the parties, a few things come to my mind. One is changing the mind, one is changing the heart. But mostly what I hope we are trying to achieve is to change people's lives, presumably for the better rather than for worse. So next to the mind and heart, we are also changing people's circumstances and perhaps conditions by the virtue that they agree to certain things. Their lives might change, hopefully for the better. When it comes to the changes, as you call it, in the neurostructures, how that is reflected in these changes on the deep biological level when it comes to changing somebody's mindset versus changing somebody's circumstances. That's question number one. And the question number two is, we typically are engaged in face-to-face communication with the parties. But there are a variety of types of communication, and I like to call them indirect communication. And we can really see it today when we watch this extraordinary polarization within the country, where we have essentially two camps which are not really talking to each other. They are talking either over each other, they are having parallel conversations, if you can say that, and occasionally there are forms of indirect communications like provocations, which is the part of the game which we are kind of engaged in. So I wanted to kind of understand and ask you the question, how do you distinguish between direct forms of communications of face-to-face and those which are indirect? So those were two different questions.
Yeah. When you say indirect in relationship to the kind of adversarial battles that you were referring to in the public space,
Yes.
help me understand your the connection between those indirect, what you mean by indirect?
Indirect means, let's just say that you have two media camps, and they are proposing certain ideological angles, and they do not talk to each other.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I think I understand, yeah. Well, yeah, to address the second one first, I mean, you said it, they're not talking with each other. They're talking maybe at each other. Their goals are to win and to be right. And they are holding strongly to their worldview. And that, you know, in our field, we've wanted to bring those sides together to the degree that we can. And of course, they have to be willing. And so there have been the experiences of bringing the right to lifers with the right to choice together, the Palestinians and the Israelis together. You know, we want to, and we're until we. I mean, that's the goal of this field, is to somehow change what you've pointed out as kind of an extreme at the social level example of non-communication, or where communication is not, where it's a battle rather than a collaborative process. We use that term collaborative. We want people to work together, as we've been talking earlier about that partnership in creating a joint reality. You know, in the public policy realm, joint fact finding is that effort to avoid the adversarial science. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, they're not doing that.
I don't know if the question was answered, but definitely you stated the ultimate predicament.
Yeah, I mean, but it's the, you know, conflict is inherent in human life because we are all different to one degree or another. We live with difference. We want the sameness. We want sameness. I want everybody to agree with me. I want my in-group to encompass the whole planet. But difference is right now, you know, between you and me, we have different backgrounds, we have different histories. Every relationship, in a sense, is a cross-cultural relationship. It depends on how much different there is, but two white men who are 6 feet tall, middle-class upbringing and the same education still differ to some degree. So we live with difference, and difference is difficult for the reasons that we've talked about, because it has to do with our experience of the world and ourselves. And so we have to find ways to work with difference. And, you know, all of the conversation these days about equity and diversity, we're struggling with, but it's been a species long. And, you know, looking on the positive side, hey, we're grappling with this in ways that maybe are a bit more effortful than they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. That maybe, if you want to look at the glass half full, that we are, even as things seem so grim at the public level, that maybe we're trying to work this stuff out. How do we be with differences? So let me go on to your first question and then get to other questions. Please. But your first question, I'm forgetting.
The first question was about the change. And I
Oh,
kind
yeah,
of
change, yeah,
multiple types of
circumstances.
change you are attempting.
Yeah. Well, just, briefly, what if I'm understanding what you were saying, the internal change of head and heart, and first of all, it's the whole body, it's the whole person. We make these distinctions between emotional and the emotional and rational, but it's always whole, and we need to, when we're working with people, a mediator can tend to, and this is maybe one of the problems with lawyers being mediators or judges being mediators, that we can tend to be very analytical and linear and rational problem solvers, when really we have to, it can improve things if we take into account head and heart, as you say, just to use those words. But the relationship between context and the change that parties, and of course I'm not trying to make change in their life. I'm just trying to help them make changes that they see as salutary. But certainly, there's an intimate relationship between context and personal experience, and whatever change happens internally will then change their context, but change in context will impact them. So, in terms of creating durable agreements, it's good to look ahead and maybe make some contingent agreements about what if there's going to be a change in the context, what impact will that have in terms of, a comprehensive agreement. Thanks for your questions. Yeah. Others?
Let me surface a question from Rosa. She wrote, I think it's important for her as a mediator to know about the neural basis of conflicts and the relevance of the delay between stimulus and response. First, to understand why people in a mediation react more than a response to what they interpret as a threat to the other party, and then train myself in skills and techniques to use with parties and help them. So do you have any specific techniques she can use in a mediation session drawn on some of these dynamics?
Techniques to,
I think the notion of this relevance of the delay between stimulus and response, to understand why people in a mediation react in a way where they interpret responses to a threat. Rosa, did I put that right? Do you want to elaborate a little bit further, or okay, I think we got it. So
I was looking through my book this morning just to refresh my contact with it, and was reminded of a case that I talk about in there. It was two women cousins who were co-operating a business that was having a lot of trouble, and they had been very close, and in this conflict things had really degraded in their relationship. And at one point I was mediating with them, working with them in a room that had a kind of a long table, and I was at one end and they were on each side. And suddenly, in a moment, they were, in one of our sessions, standing up and yelling at each other and kind of reaching across the table as if they were going to, hit each other. They didn't, but they were pointing at each other and calling each other names and yelling. And so I, in an attempt to kind of settle them, I also stood up and I put a hand out. I think I actually may have even touched them, put my hand on each of their arms, but if not, just kind of put my hands up, got them to sit down with a tone of voice that was loud enough to overcome the level of their voice. But then, and this goes to what you were asking about, Rosa, then what I asked them to do, I asked them to turn their chairs around so they weren't facing each other. And I asked them to just take some time to breathe, just to relax. And I normalized their feelings. I said, I know you both feel strongly, and there's nothing wrong with those strong feelings. They're real. But so I wasn't trying to tell them not to feel that way, but what we want to do is increase that delay between stimulus and response, which is a capacity that humans have that, for instance, reptiles don't have. And so I had them not face each other in order to reduce the amount of activation that was happening as they visually saw each other. Because when they saw each other, the visual went into there and activated their neural structures. And that actually helped. So, and I don't know that I've ever, maybe one other time I've asked parties to turn around, but it's a great technique. And I think I often don't do it because I don't think parties are going to be willing to do it. You know, ideally what I'd like to do is have them sit back to back so that they actually touched each other's back. They could feel each other. I've never done that, but yeah, so, you know, and I know everybody here could name some other things that they've done to try and reduce the activation and help. Somebody has said, and it may have been Fisher or somebody, you know, talks about how we don't want, it's not that we want to take emotions out of the mediation room, but we don't want, Bernie, you might help me here, but, you know, we don't want the emotions to drive our decision making. We want them to be taken into account, but we don't want them to be we're looking at Jonathan Haidt's idea, you know, we don't want the elephant to be too powerful. Yeah.
We want them to use our emotions. We want them to inform what's happening.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily want to vomit them all over each other.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Cathartic. It's not about catharsis. It's about integrating our emotions with what's important to us. Is stuff that I've
that's right. Using the emotions to create information for us upon which to base what we're trying to do.
Lorraine asked a question I think builds on this. I mean, she asked about the interaction of embodied conflict and forgiveness processes. And forgiveness, yeah. And she also wanted you to talk a little bit about embodied conflict and sort of bullying, mobbing, and PTSD in dispute situations. So can you speak to those topics? How would you approach those, you know, informed by some of the work you've done in embodied conflict?
Yeah, forgiveness is such a big subject. As you all know, I don't feel like an expert. I feel a bit, you know, funny to be put on the seat of, you know, having the answers. I really don't. And it'd be great if we had time just to all have a conversation about the issues. But, you know, when I think about forgiveness, you know, I think about in terms of, you know, the subject of this book, the reconstruction of our neural matrices of meaning, the reconstruction of our understanding of the world and the other and ourselves and the relationship of us to the other person. That in order to forgive, for real forgiveness to happen, there has to be, again, change, as we were talking about. It has to be a change from, you know, retribution to forgiveness is a change of our understanding of the world. And that's not something that can be forced or demanded. It can be cultivated. And so, you know, if the parties are wanting to talk about forgiveness, then, you know, we do what we do. We ask questions. You know, what would you need, and what would that look like, and what would be in the way of, and so, and PTSD is really, you know, one thing I think to remember is how complicated human beings are, and it can help have a bit of help us with a bit of humility and also a bit of compassion for the work that we're trying to do. Here's an extreme example I just read. You may know of in Holland during the war, there was a winter of starvation, of real starvation, and there were women who were pregnant during that period. There was a study subsequently done of the children born from that period over decades, and what was apparent was that there was a higher incidence of obesity, diabetes, and even schizophrenia in that cohort of children. That was a sociological study. Recently, there's been some research on roundworms that demonstrates that when you subject roundworms to trauma and stress, the offspring have a change in their genetics. It's not just an epigenetic change as a result of subsequent conditions. There's actually a change in their genes. And if the trauma was short-term, the genetic change only was expressed in the subsequent generation. If it was longer term, even the grandchildren demonstrated this genetic change, which suggests that we are all walking around with influences from our past that we're not aware of. And I mention that only kind of as an extreme example of kind of the mystery of what it means to be a human being. And PTSD, we are always, I had some difficult stuff happen in my childhood. I still have some of that PTSD that I'm dealing with. And the parties that come into the room, it's not just the issues that they're dealing with, they bring everything that they are into the room. And there are limits to what we can do. And to recognize those limits is, I think, really important.
Absolutely. I want to surface Tom's question. I think he was responding, we were talking about translation. And the word translator, you often think that it's between English and another language, but that he liked this notion that sort of there's always a translation even between your understanding and mine. Even if we speak the same language, we still have that difference and have to do that translation. I think he was saying that's a powerful concept for a mediator to absorb.
Yeah. One of the things that I bring up in the book is not being cavalier about listing the issues. We train, new mediators, start out, well, what are the issues here? And you might put them up on the board and feel quite proud of yourself as a mediator. Here's this list of issues. And then, okay, issues. Now let's go on to interests. And recognizing exactly what you were just saying, Tom and Colin, that the issues may mean very different things. Those words on the board mean, and so not just taking for granted that when you put an issue up the board, it means the same thing to each of them. And indeed, that what it means for you as the mediator is the same as what it means for either of them or both of them. So listing the issues, but then let's explore what do these issues actually mean? What do these words mean to you? Yeah.
I've thought about that in the cross-cultural context too. People often think that culture is like, oh, well, American versus Chinese versus French culture. But as you say, everybody has their own culture. And sometimes a lot of what the mediator is doing is translating between cultural expectations as well. So I like that idea of mediator as translator. I'm going to think about that a little bit more. Tom also said, in terms of forgiveness, in my experience, it's important to remind people that forgiveness does not mean that the event did not have consequences. And those consequences, results are real and will still be true after forgiveness.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Well, we all know about the whole realm of or sector of restorative practice and some of the more extreme cases of restorative efforts between a mom and the person who murdered her child. So the impacts are there, and acknowledging those. Interestingly, the case that I mentioned with the betrayal, the multiple betrayals of the man in the relationship, they had to go on. They were going to be co-parents, and for them to embrace what had happened, they had to, and in that case, they were able to. They had to certainly acknowledge the impacts for both of them. And they had to, I speak about in the book at one point, we all want to be heroes in our story in one way or another. We're the protagonists, but we need to have some level of dignity or positive self-definition. If there's going to, that will help at least in the resolution. And so here's this guy who had just multiply betrayed and lied to his wife. How were they going to, how could they create a story in which there was at least some understanding for what he'd done? you know, it brings up the whole issue of self-forgiveness. And each of us, you know, most of us have hurt somebody in our life, have failed in one way or another, or have failed ourselves in terms of meeting our expectations for performance of one sort or another. And to grow and to move forward, we know for ourselves requires both that forgiveness and that recognition of the consequences, not denying those. And so that's true for the parties we work with as well. And at a community level, that's true as well. It's just so hard to make all this happen. We don't have a magic wand. It's not a simple thing to accomplish.
Well, as you say, forgiveness, it's a deep topic. I know we could talk more about that. Lorraine talks about some of the forgiveness works that she does in her conflict coaching. I think it's important, that distinction, to say, just because I forgive you that you did something, it doesn't mean you didn't do it. So the last point I want to make
Also, if I
please.
can
Yeah.
just add one piece, it's really not just I forgive you, but I let go of, so to speak, the hope of a different past, a better past, so that I can move on. You are almost secondary in my forgiving you. I'm letting go of that anger, that being locked into the event and its consequences. And I think this reflects, you know, I mean, you can address that, Tim, from a neural point of view, but I think that's what allows the space to construct a future, not as if the event didn't happen, but beginning now on where we are now.
Well, I know we're running out of time here. There's so many rich topics here, but I did want to surface, this is connected to Milan's second question. Doug posted something. He said, particularly in politicized disagreements and value-based disputes, it seems that exposure to information that logically should create uncertainty actually causes parties to double down. In a sense, it's almost like this facts don't matter argument. You know, how do you help someone cultivate a sense of curiosity and mutual understanding, even if it's not necessarily agreement, just to shake their certainty? That's like the key question of our times. So
yeah,
I don't know, Tim, if you want to talk about that from a neurological perspective.
Well, we've always talked in the field about how value-based disagreements, when we look at kind of the source of a conflict, if it's a value-based conflict, those are the hardest conflicts to resolve. And the reason that that's so is that values permeate our whole brain, just to put it in that way. You know, that it matters broadly and deeply. And so to change a value is a bigger change than changing whether the settlement is $10,000 or $7,500. It affects more of our identity, basically. And so I mean, it's probably too big a subject to talk about now at any more length, about, you know, how do you deal with value differences, and how do you get people to, at least, as you were saying, Colin, appreciate the differences.
Yeah, and I think identity-based conflict obviously is very different than transactional type disputes, but it's like, you not agreeing with me is threatening my very existence and the existence of my whole community. And that means I'm not going to back down. You know, I'm not going to introduce that uncertainty, because I'm not going to question my own right to be who I am, which I can't change. So I think that that's kind of what Doug's getting at. I think as people have turned these positional debates into identity-based disputes, they're behaving in a different way. So it's not like we're going to find mutual agreement on whether or not I have a right to be who I am, you know?
Yeah.
So maybe that's,
and you know, one of the points that I made earlier and that I say in the book is that, in a way, every conflict is an identity-based conflict, but how much that's so, there's a continuum.
Right.
And I think I'd love to see us be able to educate the public more. Like, I really feel like, that I would like to be able to write a book that encapsulates kind of the core ideas in this for the more general public.
Mhm.
I think education, helping people realize that these value-based conflicts challenge our identity, just being aware of that can create more comfort with the differences, that recognition, that understanding. And just to the point of, when we give more information, people, that whole confirmation bias issue, one of the subjects we haven't talked about is how we can better understand the perceptual biases of confirmation bias, implicit bias, fundamental attribution error, naive realism, stereotyping, prejudice, all of those perceptual biases we can understand in the kind of neural construct way. And when people understand, that's why education is so important, then we can understand, hey, we all have confirmation. I mean, we all have confirmation bias. We all have implicit biases, unavoidably, by the very nature of how our reality constructs are created as a result of the encoding of perceptual experience that happens for all of us. We can't escape that. And so, but understanding that then can help us manage it, hold it, work with it, and be more compassionate to ourselves and others.
Well, as I said, this conversation could go on for another 3 hours and it would be fascinating all the way through, but I want to respect everybody's time. And I think it's a good place to end it, Tim. I want to thank you for this great book, this great session, and maybe we can all give Tim a round of applause. Yeah.
Hey, thank you, Bernie, for taking the time and to read the book.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to do it.
Yeah, appreciate it. And Colin for making it happen. And for all of you, here we are together and we're all dealing with what it's like to be human beings. And
it's messy and it's confusing, but it's also fun. So
okay.
if we were all the same, it'd be super boring. So
And it's also necessary.
It's necessary. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining.
Bye.
Have a great day, and
Thank
we'll
you.
see you soon.